Doctors Without Borders has now put out a statement regarding the healthcare worker just quarantined after arriving at Newark Airport. Quote, "We confirm that the person in quarantine is a returned MSF, which is the initials in French for Doctors Without Borders, staff person. At this stage, we have only seen media reports about new guidelines announced by New York and New Jersey. We are therefore not in a position at this stage to comment on the new guidelines themselves. As all throughout the Ebola crisis in West Africa, Doctors Without Borders has enacted strict protocols governing the return of its health workers to their home countries. We act in full compliance with official public health regulations. Earlier this week, we adjusted our protocols for returned staff in accordance with new U.S. federal guidelines. We have every intention of complying with any new protocols." Now, of course, Dr. Craig Spencer also worked for Doctors Without Borders, and the talk of New York City today was whether or not Dr. Craig Spencer should have taken the subway after he returned home from treating Ebola patients in Guinea. On this show, we've talked over and over again about just how truly difficult it is to transmit Ebola. Well, today, I revisited the topic with Dr. Peter Hotez, an infectious disease specialist, on one of the very subway lines that Spencer took. So we're on the A train right now. As we were coming down to meet you, we were talking a little bit on the elevator, and we were just discussing about whether this doctor should have gotten on the train.
Right.
And this woman says, just apropos overhearing our conversation, like, it was completely irresponsible. And I've heard that from a lot of people, like, what the hell was this guy thinking getting on the train? The A train's one of the lines he took, as we know from last night. What do you think about that?
Well, I can understand why people are upset and concerned. The reality is that it's when you're in the early stages of this virus infection, it's very difficult to transmit from person to person. This is not, if the doctor had influenza, I'd say, yeah, then there's a lot of risk of it infecting other people. But this is not a virus that's transmitted via the aerosol route. Unless you come in direct contact with blood or other bodily fluids of this individual, you're not going to get Ebola.
So you don't think it was irresponsible of him?
Well, I can't answer it that way.
You're not going to say it definitively.
I mean, you could argue that anybody who comes from an affected country should isolate themselves for at least a week or two after they arrive. But the risk of this individual infecting others on the subway is essentially zero.
Right.
And
well, so part of the issue here, right, is that, like, okay, so we're in like a rush hour train.
Yeah.
It's packed.
Right.
We're close together.
Right.
Walk me through the microbiology of the difference between the flu, which I could get from you here, and the microbiology of Ebola, which I can't. Like, I think that's the key thing to understand. Like, why is it the case that if I am this close to you on a train, I could get the flu?
Okay, so let's talk about several different diseases.
Yeah.
So one of them is the common cold caused by a rhinovirus infection.
Right.
You've got snotty nose, and you're touching your secretions, and you're wiping your nose, and then you'll you'll shake someone's hand.
Or grab onto
Shake
this.
someone's hand, that will transmit the infection because you'll then inoculate yourself by putting it in your eyes and your mouth, or it can live for a while in what are called fomites. Fomite refer to any inert substance, like a
You're really grossing me out about holding.
So it can live for a short term, and that's why, you know, if you do a lot of airline travel, you get colds.
Right.
You know, everyone talks about getting colds.
So let's go back to that point. Fomites, which the common cold or the flu can live in, right? Or the flu also?
Yeah. Now the flu, in addition to being transmitted by the route we just discussed, with the flu, what happens is if you cough and you cough on an inert surface, you can pick up the virus that way. Or if I cough, this virus can actually aerosolize, and if I cough into your mouth or your nose or sneeze, you can get it directly.
So that's the way people think of transmission. They think of it in terms of flu and the cold, and they know that I can get it from, if you have the cold and you put your hand here and I put my hand here.
But that's only because there's two infections people know about. I mean, infectious diseases are transmitted by all sorts of routes.
Sure.
Right? They're insects, mosquitoes, which would transmit dengue fever or transmit chikungunya, but they won't transmit it by that route. Or
so you can't get malaria, for instance, by just riding the subway next to someone.
It requires a mosquito in this case.
Because the virus has to actually get drawn from the blood and injected through the blood.
That's right. Well, that and it's adapted to the mosquito. So that's why we call them arboviruses or arbo infections.
So in the case, so the common cold, the flu, we know why I'm exposing myself to risk here, right? So the difference with Ebola is what? Like,
the difference with Ebola is twofold. One, it's not transmitted by the aerosolized route, as far as we know. Certainly not in the early stages of the disease. That's point one.
So the cough and the sneezing, the things that I think about it sort of spraying out.
That's right. That's not transmitting getting Ebola virus infection. I think the other key important point is if you're well enough to walk around, the amount of virus you have in your body is extremely low. And that's a very important point.
Because the virus is, I mean, what makes it scary and what makes it so deadly is that it is a massively potent thing that expands exponentially in your blood and takes over the host so powerfully that by the late stages, it's got you in a way where you're not walking around.
So as what I call it are the two faces of Ebola virus, two faces of Eve, two faces of Ebola virus. So Ebola virus in the early stages of infection, the virus is just replicating in your body. In the first week that you have it, first of all, you're not having any symptoms, and even when you first have symptoms, the amount of virus in your body is extremely low. That's why you don't get Ebola virus on the subway. That's why you don't get Ebola virus just walking around Monrovia in Liberia.
That's right. In fact, for perspective, I mean, how many people live in Liberia?
So in Liberia, we're looking at a population of around 26 million people, ironically about the same size as the population of Texas, where I'm from.
And we've got about 5,000 cases, is that right?
About almost 10,000 cases and 5,000 deaths.
5,000 deaths,
yeah.
Right. So even in the place where it is a genuine epidemic, an epicenter.
It's still a relatively rare disease at this point. So one of the numbers that I use, the three affected countries of Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea have roughly the same population as the state of Texas. And in Texas, every year, we have 1,000 to 2,000 people who die in drunk driving accidents. Pretty serious problem.
Yeah.
The number of died of Ebola is about twice that number. And remember, who are those people that are getting infected? It's only people who are taking care of sick Ebola patients in the hospital, because what happens is
hospital workers and family members.
That's right. We're burying the dead. So right now, if you had to ask me, what am I worried about here in New York? I'm not worried about anybody on the subway or any other subway in New York. I'm not worried anybody in any bowling alley in New York. What I'm worried about are the nurses and healthcare professionals who are taking care of Dr. Spetzer in Bellevue Hospital. Because over time, he could progress to have lots and lots of virus, and then they're at risk of transmission. Just like if you look at what happened in Dallas, none of the outpatient contacts of Mr. Duncan, none of the contacts with
It was only the nurses. Right.
It's only the nurses.
Right. All right, Dr. Hotez, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, during this time of high anxiety over Ebola, it is so important that the president gave this woman a huge bear hug, and I'll tell you why next.